Good afternoon to everyone. I take this opportunity to welcome all the participants to today's session on cross-border supply chain structuring, a very niche subject in international tax, and with an expert speaker. We also have today with us on the webinar WIRC Chairman C. Lalit Bajaj and Regional Council Member C. A. Manish Gadia. So let me welcome all of you, and let us now request the WIRC Chairman to present his views to everyone. Lalit bhai, over to you.
Aditya ji, all participants, I welcome all of you and in this webinar on a subject which is very niche, and we all will try to get some insight from your session. My colleagues in council, Murtuza Kachwala and Manish Gadia ji, both are doing an excellent job by gearing in sharing education through webinars. The day we went in lockdown, in couple of days we started with webinars, and I think so this is the best way where we can interact with each other and share knowledge and serve to the purpose of members and students. One simple thing which I wanted to share from my side was, as we all have sufficient time at our home, what we have done is we have uploaded all the publications, some of the publications of WIRC on WIRC website, which are available free, with the only idea that members and students can go through them, and if at all they are relevant, they can refer and enhance their knowledge at this time. So I request all of you to take benefit of that. Over and above that, we have been doing a couple of other things. We will be regularly interacting with you and updating you about our initiatives. Till that time, thank you, each one of you, and wish you happy learning. Thank you, Murtaza.
Thank you, Lalit bhai. May I now request Regional Council Member C. A. Manish Gadia to please introduce the speaker and welcome him. Manish bhai, over to you.
Thank you, Murtuza bhai, for giving me this opportunity. Today we have with us C. A. Aditya. He is a partner at Dhruva Advisors LLP. Prior to that, he was partner with the KPMG in their tax practice and also worked with other big fours like PwC, EY in their tax practice. His focus area has been transfer pricing, supply chain structuring in cross-border transactions, P contribution, inbound and outbound entry, exit and profit cash representation strategies. He has worked several complex transactions in transfer pricing, including industrial franchisee agreement, etc. He is regularly contributing article in various Indian as well as international tax journal and regularly giving lectures at various forums. So we have with us Sri Aditya ji, and I request him for his presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Murtuza bhai.
Thank you, Manish bhai. Aditya, over to you.
Thank you, sirs. Thank you for this wonderful introduction. So I think so. I have 1.5 hours to do this presentation, probably 1 hour 15 minutes, and then in the last 15 minutes I'll be taking some questions. Well, the topic being so complex, I cannot say that I'll be able to scratch the surface also, because it's so intense. It can take a week also, and I can keep on speaking about it. So what little I can do, I can just throw some, broad high-level ideas around this subject and how it is becoming relevant in today's times. It's an interplay not only of transfer pricing from corporate tax, but also customs and other indirect taxes like GST, other issues like free trade agreements. So it's not a subject in isolation. So I don't know how many of us would have heard of the word supply chain, value chain. We've used it very randomly, but have you ever gone and looked into the meaning of these words? Well, you'd be surprised that before 2010, even OECD had never spoken about these words, whether it was a value chain or a supply chain. This was more of a word which was used by the McKinseys and the BCGs of the world. It was not a subject or not a topic which would be, touched upon by tax professionals. But if you look at what came up in the action 8 to 10 of the OECD TP guidelines, and then the final TP guidelines in the latest TP guidelines, OECD TP guidelines of 2017, there is a frequent use of the word value chain, value drivers, supply chain, and not until 2018 there was a clear-cut definition given by OECD on value chain. Interestingly, in 2017, they spoke very extensively in the document, which was a draft document for public consultation on profit split methods. They spoke a lot about value chain and supply chain and key value drivers, but in the final document in 2018, they excluded a large part of it, because they felt somewhere uh, people across the tax administrators and consultants and taxpayers would see that probably the word value chain, supply chain, value drivers is synonymous with the concept of profit splits. How much you may want to hide, but you cannot hide the truth. The truth is that actually this concept of supply chain and value chain is best applied in the case of profit splits. So we have all known that different transfer pricing methods are there for setting up intercompany price, and most of the methods have been one-sided methods: a cost plus, or a resale minus, or a transactional net margin, or something of that sort. So single-sided methods. So I can look at the profit of a particular entity and say the transaction in intercompany price is at arm's length. Never before, what at this intensity was it explored that what is the system profits. And I would want to draw your attention to the heading of the action 8 to 10 final reports, which is, interestingly, the word value creation, value chain was referred in the heading itself. So if you read the heading is aligning transfer pricing outcomes with value creation. So the word value creation, value chain, supply chain, value driver started coming from the period of 2013 when we were preparing for the 2015 final reports. And now it's part of it. So if you see, in a subtle manner, if you look at the Indian TP documentation rules also, in a subtle manner, the Action 13 and the OECD TP guidelines, and which has now been incorporated in the Indian TP documentation requirements also, there's a requirement to put up a summary of the global supply chain and also identify the key value drivers. So it is already there in and part of our TP documentation. Now, as I said, that to some extent, supply chain, value chain is more synonymous with the word profit split, because profit split looks into the appropriate allocation of profits between multiple entities. So assume company A sources raw materials, company B processes it to a particular extent, company C adds the technology to it, company D gives a final look to it and a branding and packaging to it, and company E goes and sells it finally to the customer. These are all links of the supply chain. And what transfer pricing now intends to do is, so it's not deviated away from the function analysis, assets used, and the risks assumed. It is still sticking to the basic principles of transfer pricing. But what it wants to look into is that has there been a proper allocation of profits between these 5 entities? Whereas in the past, it was more limited to looking at the profits in one of the entities, testing the transaction from a one side. So value chain is to a large extent synonymous with profit splits. Now, giving you a little bit broad concept of the word value chain, supply chain, and showing you the definitions of value chain, value driver, key value drivers, value chain, again, all of this which has come in the OECD. I would now want to embark more into what typically in the last 20 years, how corporates have migrated into something known as a principal structure. And this is with the objective of ETR optimization. My presentation would be sectioned into two parts. One is from an inbound perspective, and the second part is from an outbound perspective. As I speak from an inbound perspective, before I speak from inbound, I wanted to explain a typical principal structure. This all happened around 30, 35 years or 40 years back when McKinsey and BCG and these top consulting firms came up with this idea that the methodology for any corporate to be more efficient as it grows larger and larger is to restructure itself to have more effective supply chains, and when it and the most I'll say productive form of supply chain has been the principal structure, where it's centralization vis-a-vis decentralization. So a particular entity which is going to have operation in 40 entities, instead of having its independent R&D units in 40 places, having its independent IT centers in 40 places, having a decentralized model, it always suggested that have a centralized model. The cost of restructuring would be there initially, but after 2 or 3 years, the benefit would start steeping in. And from a commercial perspective, centralization is the mantra to success. This was spoken by the top-notch business consulting, strategy consulting firms, and tax consultants picked it up from there, companies picked it up from there, and thought that if there is a centralization which is happening, can we add a topping of a tax efficiency into it also? And these kind of structures were created where the principal entity is a central nodal entity which is assuming all the risk. It gets the R&D done from one of the entities, it gets the administrative services done from one of the entities, it creates a marketing hub where they get to see marketing done, strategy, all of it done from one of the entities, and assumes risks. So on the direction of the principal company, all of these are working. Now when it comes to selling and manufacturing, it sets up a manufacturing hub in China, it sets up a sales entity in Australia, in India, in Dubai, in whichever market it wants to go to, it sets up a sales entity. The way it used to work is all technology, shared services, marketing, strategy, everything is done by the principal, or it gets it done by some subcontractor in a subcontracted model, but everything is assumed by the principal. It gets the manufacturing done from Subco 1, as you can see from the diagram. That is a contract manufacturer at some point of time sitting in Taiwan, China, anywhere, could be in India as well. It buys the goods, gets it manufactured from them, buys it at say 40 rupees on a cost plus model, because the technology, the R&D, the shared services, the marketing, everything is assumed by the principal company. And then it sells it to the distributor at say 80 rupees. And the distributor undertakes a distribution function where it spends 15 to 17 rupees, has a 3% net margin, and sells it at 100 rupees. So the arbitrage between 40 and 80 is a remuneration for the technology, for the administrative services, for the marketing, for many more non-routine functions. And that is how all of it being hubbed and pooled into one single entity would create an efficiency from a commercial perspective. Now you place a principal company into a tax efficient location, there's a further efficiency of 15-20% on tax rates. So ideally, had it been in a high cost location, the principal company, the tax rate would have been 35-40%. They set it up in a Swiss structure, Ireland structure, or any of those Singapore structures, and in that case the tax rates go down as 5%, 10%. But in a post BEPS era, most of it may not continue. It will continue if I can still follow the rules of transparency, if I can still follow the rules of economic substance, rationale. So if I can follow all the rules of the BEPS regime, I can still continue with the structure. I've gone with the assumption, the simple assumption that say, because I've seen with the US tax reforms and the post BEPS reforms also, most of the companies have rolled back into some structures where they have gone back to their they've not migrated back from zero tax regimes for principal company to 15, 20, 25%. So post this, I've taken an example where the principal company is not sitting in a 0% or a 5%. Instead, it is sitting in a little more high tax rate, let's say 17 to 25%. Now, if I look at the tax rate of India, the way it stands today, I am for a moment ignoring the 15% tax rate because I'm looking at existing operations. I'm not looking at new investments, if they are green, if they're new projects, they'll be at 15%. But considering 25% and there's a withholding tax, say of 10% following the treaty with that particular country. So the effective tax cost for operations in India, corporate tax plus the cost of repatriation of dividends, would be to the tune of 32.65%. And I've generally seen that most of the companies where dividends is received from foreign operations, dividend is tax exempt. So, looking at that, I've considered that India tax rate, effective tax rate for operations is 32.65, and for the principal company 17 to 25, it could be even lower. So, looking at a 17 or a 20 and a 32, there's an arbitrage of 10 to 15%. So, the model which I discussed in the previous slide, where where in India the contract manufacturer of 40 rupees is there, out of which there will be a margin of 5 rupees, 4 to 5 rupees or 2 rupees, because it's cost plus 5-6%. The distributor will have a 3 to 4% margin, and the rest of the whole profits will be sitting in the principal company, and rightly so, because the principal company is doing all the strategic functions, significant functions. It is just getting it contract manufactured from India and just appointing a distributor company in India and selling the goods. All strategy, marketing, everything is designed, implemented, everything is done by the principal company sitting in one of the locations. Say UK is 17%, Singapore is 17%. So looking at these countries, if it is housed in any of these any of these countries, the tax rate will be 17 to 25%. Now, is this structure possible? The typical principal structure which I showed in the preceding slide, when I replicate this in the India scenario, and I keep the contract manufacturing base, so I'm sure if anyone is having a target customer base in India and just wants a distribution activity and the contract manufacturing activity to happen in India, it will not, it will make sense because India is a low cost manufacturing location. It will not set up its manufacturing base in a country other than India. So it sets up a manufacturing base, which is a pure contract manufacturing base, sets up a distribution just for sales, and does all strategy functions, everything sitting outside India. But what happens is that in the preceding model, the contract manufacturer would have sold it to the principal company at 40 rupees. The principal company in turn would have sold it to the distributor company at 80 rupees. The 40 rupees would have been retained. Out of the 40 rupees, it would have incurred the cost of expenditure, brand, marketing, strategy, and everything. So not that 40 rupees would be taken home by the principal company, but say after all expenditure, it would have still retained a profit of
Aditya sir. Hello, Aditya sir.
हेलो आदित्य
नेटवर्क
can you
इशू तुमको नेटवर्क इशू आ रहा है, फोन लगा रहा हूँ.
okay I'll request the participants to please hold on for some time.
अपना कैमरा बंद कर चालू करें, पीपीटी चेंज करें.
We can see you, Aditya. If you can just speak up little with your mic. Yeah, your mic is on. If you can just speak, Aditya. Aditya, can you listen to me?
Sound नहीं आ रहा, sound.
हेलो आ गया तो
Okay sir, okay sir, okay sir.
hello
Please go ahead.
my apologies I don't know so probably there's been a significant internet usage, that's why there was a bandwidth problem, but thankfully I'm back. So yeah, so in this kind of a construct, why it would not work is that due to regulatory challenges, what happens is that no AD banker would let the distributor company, that is the India Subcorp 2 company, remit for purchase of tangible goods if the physical movements are not happening from outside India. That means if there's no bill of entry, it will not allow the distributor to remit for the payment. So therefore, this construct can never work. Therefore, there will never be a possibility that I can migrate the profits, Indian profits, which is actually duly to be earned by the principal company, if the contract manufacturing and the distribution base are in India. So what eventually happens? Eventually what would happen is that the Indian contract manufacturer would take ideas, knowledge, everything from the principal company. It will manufacture it. It will give it to the distributor. The distributor will have a return on sales and sell it to the customer. So it'll never have the returns. The principal company will never have these significant entrepreneur returns. They will all get locked in India. In a conventional Indian scenario, there would never be two entities. There will be a manufacturing division and a sales division,
And please mind the words of perform less significant people functions. So it continues to be a contract manufacturer. It continues to be a limited sales entity, but it is in one single unit. Therefore, it will become a licensed manufacturer. But being a licensed manufacturer, still the principal company is a rightful owner of all the entrepreneur profits, but it is still getting locked in India. How that unlocking of those profits, the entrepreneur profits, happens is the form of a royalty. So a royalty for technology, for brand, for strategy, all of that is paid. Now, over the last decade, what I've seen, last decade or probably last 2 centuries, because India is completing, last 2 decades, I've seen in India, India is completing 2 decades of transfer pricing. What is generally followed for royalties is a cup method. Now, cup, what will happen is you'll get a cup for a particular licensed manufacturer who's actually undertaking significant functions in India. He's just taking the technology, the trademark, but the royalty agreement will never capture significant value add functions, strategy functions, which the principal company is giving to the Indian subco company. That will never be captured. Therefore, what will happen is, say, I'll get a benchmark of a royalty rate of 3%, 2%, 4%, and I will never be able to cross the number beyond that. So what I will be paying to the principal company would have been a 4%, 5%, where vis-a-vis what would have been the rightful due to the principal company would have been something more higher of 10%, 12%, 15% also. Because I'm assumed that the manufacturing division in this entity is a simple contract manufacturer. The sales and division is just doing a limited sales activity. So there are no significant people functions being undertaken in India. And the principal company undertakes major and most of the significant people functions. Therefore, it will be the rightful owner of most of the entrepreneur profits after paying for the routine returns. Knowing that CAPA has its limitations, knowing it will be a 3%, 4%, 5%, what in an alternative scenario, had I been importing materials in a CKD form or in a limited, in some half-cooked form or in a semi-finished form, and I would have assumed that the semi-finished form of goods have the intangibles embedded in it. In that case, I could have still migrated the entrepreneur profits or I'll say the profits towards significant people functions in the form of the import price, and I would still not have to pay a royalty. So I could have parted with the profits pertaining to the significant people functions in the form of two forms: royalties of 2%, 3%, 4%, which I could benchmark, and a residual value in the form of import price. A little bit of a ticking up the import price would have also parted with those profits, and India would have earned its rightful returns of a return on sales of 3 to 4%, a return on the value adding expenses, or return on full cost plus manpower. But assume that supply chain linkage is not in that manner, that there will be an import of materials from the principal company. The materials or raw materials are all procured locally in India, or the Indian entity buys it directly from third-party suppliers across the world. Then this opportunity of repatriating the entrepreneur profits within the import price would not exist. What would happen after this is one has to then look at this option. And that is why I was saying that with the concept of value chain, supply chain, you will start looking into not one-sided profits, you will start looking into both-sided profits. And I've seen in a typical case where we corroborated this before with the support of a profit split, that after giving, so whatever activities are being undertaken by the Indian subco, whatever activities are being undertaken by the principal company, we put all of it on the table. We showed that the nature of contribution which is happening from the principal company was far more higher. Rather, it was literally controlling the operations, and the Indian subco was literally the executioner, just doing the contract manufacturing function, just limited to the extent of selling activity and distribution activity, not strategy in any manner. So after giving routine returns for the manufacturing function, after giving routine returns for the sales, whatever residual profits was residing, we could establish by a contribution analysis that probably 100% of that is due to the principal company. Even if someone to his far-fetched imagination came up, no, there's an Indian company doing something more, the split would not go more than an 85-15. And in this manner, one can achieve royalty rates to the extent of 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, depending on the nature of system profits. So many a times, what happens is that you want to set up a principal structure, which is a central hub in a particular location, and India is just doing limited activities, but you're not able to achieve it because of the regulatory hassle and of bill of entry and remittance, because there's no bill of entry, so therefore no remittance can happen for the tangible goods because of the regulatory hassle. So all of that hassle can be crossed over with a variable royalty fee. And a variable royalty fee, it's like putting your cards on the table before the tax officer and setting up that, look, I have X amount of profits, and this A, B, C activities are done in India, but rest everything from D to Z is done in the overseas location. And A, B, C are routine in nature. You cannot call them non-routine in nature by any way. Calling them routine in nature, and the overseas activities, even if 1 or 2 activities or 4 activities are considered routine, beyond that, most of it is non-routine. The residual profits, most of it would migrate to the principal company. And in this way, a principal structure, which is so-called approach to centralization, approach to achieve commercial efficiencies, and consequently tax efficiency, is achieved in India. So that's why I was saying that's a supply chain. So, but here what one had to do is, one had to open up the complete system profits for that particular transaction. And that is where a supply chain analysis or a value chain analysis comes into the picture. But this is all from an inbound perspective. The story changes in case of an outbound scenario. With this residual profit split method, which I just discussed, and I saw the riddle of setting up a principal structure in India, I would like to solve another riddle, which has been a creation of the Indian revenue. The Indian revenue has been attacking the entrepreneur license manufacturers. So this slide is one extreme, where the Indian company just does the limited activity of manufacturing, does the limited activity of sales, and nothing beyond. This is one extreme. So a residual profit split will result in giving routine returns to the Indian company, and the rest of it will be towards the entrepreneur profits. Would all of it shift into the principal company? This is one extreme. But there's another extreme. Say a Sony, say a Suzuki, say any of these high-branded LG, any of these high-branded companies. They are definitely not working in that extreme. They are at the other end of the spectrum, where they do get technology to a large extent strategy support from outside, but there is an independent strategy, marketing, and everything, the full-fledged complete team sitting out in India, undertaking and strategizing the market, identifying which products to launch in the market, taking feedback from the headquarters, and proactively involved in the business decision making. So that's the other end of this spectrum. Here what happened, the Indian revenue officers started alleging that the AMP expenditure of the Indian entity is significantly higher. So they started comparing LG with Samsung or an LG with any other manufacturer, and started saying that, look, the AMP spend is significantly higher. Therefore, you are ending up creating a brand, or you're building up the brand for the foreign company. Therefore, you are in effect rendering services to the foreign company. And the nature of adjustment is to give effect was something like this. Say the taxpayer turnover is 10,000. There's a material cost of 2,500, which is purchases from group companies. There's a royalty of 200, which it pays. And there's an AMP expense of 600. The AMP to sales for the taxpayer, say an LG, Samsung, or any of the big brands, L'Oreal, would be to the tune of 6%. And it identified comparables in the same sector. Now, I don't know whether there will be comparables, because each of these entities, L'Oreal or any of these big brands, would be acting in India in its entrepreneur capacity. So technically speaking, they can never be a comparable. I will say they identified competitors. So identify competitors, look at the level of AMP, and say that, okay, you got a 2% excess AMP expenditure. We have done that much of promotion of foreign brand in India. Therefore, you need to recover that 2% plus a service fee. But they in effect forgot that what they are looking at is an entrepreneur. You cannot, and I repeat, you cannot take the royalty transaction, the material cost transaction, and A&P in isolation. If one has to see all of it in combination. There's a high probability that there is entrepreneur profit or there is intangible profits embedded in the 2,500 for material cost. Royalty itself is an intangible, so obviously the profits towards the intangibles is embedded in it. And so that is something which cannot be seen in isolation. So what they used to do is they used to do a transaction net margin method and say, okay, your taxpayer is having a reasonable profitability. Vis-a-vis its comparables called by the taxpayer, but whom I call competitors. And therefore, transaction of 2,500 and 200 is at arm's length, but the transaction of A&P is not at arm's length. I don't know, it was a figment of imagination how this got created. But again, the solution which I gave in this particular slide, where the Indian subco was in one end of the spectrum, where it is just doing routine and nothing more than that. If it was in the other end of the spectrum, where it was doing significant functions, and so was the headquarter doing significant functions, the story would look something like this. Here, if you look at the red colored portions, the principal and the Indian company jointly work on sourcing, quality. The Indian company develops marketing strategies. Therefore, it is definitely adding to the residual profits, to the profits towards the intangibles. And as I've acknowledged in this presentation out here in slide number 15, that it also performs significant people functions in addition to the principal performing significant people functions. So in this inbound construct, the principal company is contributing to the intangibles. The Indian subco is also contributing to the intangibles. So if I apply the same residual profit split method out here, the manufacturing returns would be 5 to 6%, the sales returns would be 3 to 4%, and the Indian company would be entitled to a split of the residual profits. So the residual profits eventually will be split within the principal company and the Indian subco. In this way, this riddle, so first I solved the riddle of creating a principal structure in India, where most of the profits rightfully due to the principal company are repatriated to the principal company. Here I'm solving the riddle where there is a significant marketing spend, but all of that is seen in combination when splitting the profits towards intangibles. And one good thing is that in the United Nations 2017 guidelines, 2018 guidelines which have come up, there was an acknowledgement by the Indian authorities. So the India chapter did acknowledge that there is a concept known as economic ownership of intangibles. So, this reaffirms the fact that this approach of residual profit split will give the fair proportion of returns towards the intangibles by both the parties. And that is why, so again, I'm going back to the word supply chain, value chain. Had I not understood the supply chain and the value chain, that is what is being brought in, what are the costs of the principal company towards the contribution of the intangibles, what are the costs of the Indian company towards the contribution of the intangibles, what are the costs of the Indian company towards the routine functions. If I didn't understand the complete supply chain linkage, I would not be in a position to split the profits. So understanding the supply chain or the value chain is even more pertinent when you're applying profit splits. And the way it is happening, if you look at the digital economy, very recently CBDT came up with this, they also came up with this document on profit attributions, where they are acknowledging that the sales entity does contribute significantly also. Well, in this era, if there is a significant contribution by the selling entity, profit splits is the rightful answer. Although what has been suggested is more ad hoc in nature, but at least there is an acknowledgement that profits cannot be tested one-sided anymore. It needs to be seen from a value chain or a supply chain perspective. So I have shown you how a ETR could be achieved so assume their split of profits is between the Indian subco and the principal company. The principal company having a profit tax rate in the range of 17 to 25%, and the Indian subco having a tax rate to the tune of 32%, 32.65%. If there's a split of profits between the two entities and more skewed towards the principal company, the ETR will tend more towards a 70 to 25, vis-a-vis the 32.65. But just want you to watch out for my words, because here I've taken only corporate taxes in isolation. As I move to my subsequent slides, you would see that an ATR or a supply chain study cannot be done only in the context of a corporate tax. There's more to it. There's an indirect tax element to it. There's a financing cost element to it. There's a working capital component to it, and there's an indirect tax element to it. There's a free trade FTA agreement element to it also. So it's a lot more complex. It's not that simple. Here I was just trying to give you a plain vanilla example in the context of a corporate tax perspective. So I saw, with the help of a value chain, and when I say value chain, profit splits, with the help of a value chain from an inbound perspective, I solved the riddle of creating a principal structure in India. I solved the riddle of which has been created by the Indian revenue of excess AMP or excess sales and marketing expenditure by entrepreneur manufacturers in India. I will also solve another riddle with the help of profit split. And before that, I would want to look at these questions. Rather, I think so I'll go to the next slide. In my studies, which I've done over the last decade, I've realized that distributors are in these broad three. Okay, distributors, to be honest, could be as many as the colors in a rainbow, or even more than that. But the broad classification of distributors from a supply chain and from a transfer pricing perspective would be something like this. The first one would be a limited risk distributor, where he's more of an executioner. The debtor, inventory management, everything is managed by outside India. The marketing, everything is done by the entity outside India. And the Indian entity is more of an executioner. Here, the return which should be seen is something like a return on sales. But if the SG&A expenses are significantly higher in nature, so I'll go to the right-hand side, right-hand extreme. I discussed the left-hand extreme. I'll go to the right-hand extreme, and where distributor with higher SG&A or AMP. So it's a completely a lot more larger study. Whether we should discuss it in the context of an AMP or in the context of an SG&A. SG&A is selling, distribution, selling and administrative expenses, but that's a separate study in itself. But for a moment, I'm going for simplicity purposes that I'm taking selling and distribution expenses. So in the case of a distributor, assume his selling and distribution expenses are higher than the comparables which have been identified. Does it result in the distributor creating an intangible? The answer is not necessarily, but yes, in most of the cases. So if the SG&A is higher, but the activity which is undertaking on account of higher SG&A is not unique and valuable, is not non-routine in nature. If that is a characteristic of the higher SG&A, then there needs to be just an additional compensation for that. There could be an economic adjustment to the gross margin or a separate cost plus remuneration for the additional costs, but it's not the creation of an intangible. Therefore, the distributor will get its gross margins, adjusted gross margins, a little higher gross margin. Whereas if the activity which it is undertaking on account of the higher SG&A is unique in nature, non-routine in nature, and valuable in nature, mind you, these three words are very critical, then with an adjustment or a little higher gross margin, you cannot compensate that distributor. That distributor is doing something very different, something which is contributing significantly to the creation of an intangible and would be entitled under the same profit split method. And that is where again system profits and value chain and supply chain would become pertinent. So in the rest of the cases, if you see, the supply chain, the value chain does not become very significant. But in the third category, if I look at the middle category, which is distributor with comparable SG&A, so assume in a limited risk distributor, his selling distribution expenses are 15%, 10%, 12%. He'll be a limited risk distributor. Assume his SG&A expenses are to the extent of 25%. But in that industry, I'm finding comparables also with SG&A expenses of 25%. And the comparables are comparable to a large extent their SG&A expenses are comparable, the nature of expenses are similar, then in that case, even though the SG&A is very high, I found the appropriate comparable and I can close the story out there. And I will not further delve into the question, because even if there was an intangible, I've got an appropriate comparable in that case. Now looking at this, I would go back to slide number 1. How do you judge between this class of distributors? And these questions are to be answered. Whether selling or distribution expenses contribute to unique non-routine marketing intangibles. How do you find an answer? So assume the selling and distribution expenses are higher. And in that context, I need to first look at the contribution analysis of the selling distribution entity in the value chain. So if I look at the complete value chain, that means something, like a introspection. I don't look at the comparables. I do within myself whether this activity of mine is very important. So something like I'm playing a game of table tennis. Is my hand more important, my leg more important, or my nose more important, or my eyes more important? So it is an introspection. I don't compare it with something external. It's more of an introspection within myself. Which limb of mine is more important to conduct that act? So similarly, that contribution analysis is an introspection which you need to do vis-a-vis the 10 activities, which is the starting of the product to the end of the product. Whether this selling activity is critical in the supply chain or the value chain. The second part is the qualitative analysis. Well, I've kept the quantitative analysis to the end. So qualitative analysis is, I look at the comparables. Say I got 10 comparables. I look at their activities, what they're doing in the market. I look at my activities, what I'm doing. Vis-a-vis, are they taking strategy activities? Am I doing strategy activities? But this is theoretical, because I will never be able to get that information from the public domain, what my comparables are actually doing on account of the selling and distribution expenses. So 1 is feasible, but 2 is theoretical. The third part is, even if I'm doing a significant function, is the construct or the financials of the sales entity such that it can actually control the risks associated with a significant people function? So that is to be judged, which is again sort of a introspection. The fourth part is again an external study. Yeah. So the fourth part is again an external study, where in a quantitative analysis, I compare myself with the comparables and I see whether my intensity of function, my intensity of selling and distribution vis-a-vis my sales. So assume I'm having 20% and my competitors are having 25% or comparables are having 15%. I compare that. So what I've observed, to answer that question, whether selling distribution functions contribute to unique non-routine and marketing intangible, which will finally result in a profit split method, you need to look at these 4 things, of which 1 and 3 are more of introspection. 2 and 4 are external. 2 is not practical unless until you have this kind of information available in the public domain, which is generally not practical. So you rely on 4. Now the next question is, if quantitatively, because I'm not able to answer one limb of the external study, that is a qualitative analysis, I have to restrict myself to the quantitative analysis. If quantitatively selling distribution are found to be distinct from the comparables, quantitatively, and qualitatively I cannot judge, what do I do? Can economic adjustments even out the difference? Can a simple mathematical solution of giving remuneration for the additional AMP or SG&A with a return, or a simple cost plus return, or should I go for a profit split? Then I will have to rely on that first and third activity, that is the contribution analysis, and the third bullet point, that's contribution analysis and the assumption of market risk by the sales entity. That is where my introspection, which I've done vis-a-vis my operations, will help me decide whether I go for a profit split or I go for the first 3 options. So you would appreciate that how a supply chain study, how a value chain study, it's not a one-sided study that, okay, he's doing a selling function, let me give him 3%. Okay, he's doing a manufacturing, let me give him 4%. You have to understand the whole supply chain, the value chain. Without that, you will not be able to judge whether he's the rightful owner of a residual profit split method, whether he's the rightful owner of the intangible returns which is being generated from a business or not. So from an inbound perspective, this is important. Now I would come to the interplay between import duties the import duties, indirect taxes, and transfer pricing. Well, we all know that the BEPS goal was to better allocate profits where economic activity is created or where value is created. In complex supply chains, you will find there is a completely interlocking linkage between customs, indirect tax, and in transfer price. So, for example, a company decides that it will restructure its business and change its supply chain model. It's very important to see what are the consequent effects. A change in the supply chain model will result in a change in intercompany price and consequently a change in the ETR. A change in the ETR is not only limited to corporate taxes. It will also come from the other 3 bullet points if you look at that. So what might happen is that if there's a change in price, there may be change in price. That means there's a change in supply chain. That means there's a change in price. That means a change in the product nature also. And if there's a change in the product code, there's a possibility that there's a change in the import duty rate also. And if there's a change in the import duty rate, that could also affect the ETR. Now, a change IDT and import duty payout could also, because in indirect taxes, at least in India, I can say that if the import GST is increased or decreased, there is a credit against those taxes. There's not so much of a time. The challenge with the BCD. But from a cash flow perspective, I will have to have more cash in my system if I'm going to buy it at a particular price where my import duty liabilities and my indirect taxes increases. If that is a scenario, I need to have a lot more cash in the system. That means I will have to borrow more in the system. That means there will be interest costs. That means there will be effect on my profitability. That means there will be a change in my ETR. And one thing I've also seen is that if there's a change in the intercompany price in many of the FTA agreements, where the value of the goods is one of the criteria for giving the benefits of an FTA, one might lose on the benefit of an FTA also. So a change in supply chain is not linked to just the corporate price, corporate tax on account of a change in price, but it also affects many more things like custom duty, cash flow, FTA benefits getting lost, or an opportunity of FTA free trade agreement being exploited. This was, when you're setting up things, when you're planning things, but you need to be very mindful also, because if there's a transfer pricing adjustment and which you have accepted at a later point of time, so you do a transaction today, your revenue audit happens after 3 plays, it goes into litigation, you litigate it and you lose it, and you acknowledge that transfer pricing adjustment after 7 years. One will have to appreciate that generally the transfer pricing adjustments are retroactive. Different countries, give effect in a different manner. Like many countries just say you give effect in your corporate tax return, and like India has a secondary adjustment, you'll do a secondary adjustment and the chapter is over. But we should be mindful that there could be a corresponding effect in the import duty and the indirect taxes as well. What will happen if the IDT and import duty returns, which are filed 7-8 years back, do you go back and revise those returns, or do you revise it in the year when you have accepted the period of adjustment? Do you go and do a suo motu disclosure to the indirect tax or the import duty department that I've had this transfer pricing adjustment which I've accepted after 7 years? And will they force you to issue debit notes and credit notes to reflect to those adjustments? Will there actual cash flow between the parties? So if there's a TP adjustment, it's just not one, it creates a ripple effect. It's into many more other taxes and many other regulations also. So indirect taxes, import duties, all of it has a very big ramification, and I've explained this through case studies in the subsequent slides. Before I go to the example, I just did a quick study because I found that there is high custom duty in 2 sectors. One is the auto sector, automobile sector, and the second is the spirit sector. So I looked at where are these generally housed to, because for my calculation, I was trying to find what should be the tax rate I should select because for any ETR optimization, for any supply chain study or a value chain study, I need to look at the tax rate in the overseas jurisdiction as well as the India jurisdiction, and also the custom duty. So I looked at most of these were 17, 25, 25, 27, 25, 25. And similarly for alcohol manufacturers also, the spirit manufacturer, it was in the same range. So for simplicity, knowing that India's tax rate is standing today at 25%, I took that the headquarter tax rate would be also in the range of 25%. Now let us look at this example of an Indian auto manufacturer. Some basic assumptions. Basic assumptions being, as I explained, why I have taken 25%, that the overseas headquarter tax rate would be 25%, and the Indian tax rate would be again 25%, and incidence of dividend withholding tax is 10%, and dividends are tax free in the overseas headquarters. The BCD rate is 30%. These are sort of CKDs. This is what I have taken the assumption. Now, if I look at an example out here, so let's look at the first column. Here, the HO is selling CKDs to the Indian company at a sale price which is a semi-finished product at 300, and there's a BCD at the rate of 30%, which is applied out there. The Indian company imports that good, does value addition on that, and finally sells the good at 1,000 rupees in the market. There's a material cost in the headquarter, there's a material cost in the Indian company, there's a value addition cost, the other costs in the headquarter. I just factored this with numbers, and I took that the HO has a profit of 100 and the Indian company has a profit of 370. And taxes, assuming, as I said, it's 25% in India and 25% in the overseas headquarter. So 25% both the places. The total tax cost would be something to the tune of 236. And the PAT, profit after tax, would be to the tune of 324. Now, assuming every headquarter wants to pull in more profits from India, that's a very natural phenomenon. Why should I have my profits in the local location? I would want to, because I'm creating the intangible, I've created the brand, I've created the technology of the car, everything I've done. So for a Land Rover, Jaguar, or for any of the overseas big brands, BMWs of the world, they've all created the technology, the IP, all of it around that. They want that to maximize the profits in Germany. It's a very logical thing. And they would want to increase the sale price of that CKD component. And they increase it from 300 to 350. I took a different example. For a moment, let's take it, they decrease it also. And I looked at the effect. What is happening is that, which is a very natural phenomenon, that the headquarter would want to have little larger share of the profits or even the rightful share of the profits. So it increases its material cost and tries to pull out profits in the form of embedded within the material cost. The total tax cost goes from 236 to 242. My ATR goes down. Whereas if I push more profits into India and I am more safe from a transfer pricing officer's scrutiny by pushing more profits into India, my ATR goes down. So many a time we end up putting up an intercompany price just looking at the corporate tax rates, but it's just not that. One cannot limit our study to that. So apparently it might look that the tax cost from India would be 25 plus dividend, and it's coming to 36.5. Whereas if I had retained those profits in the headquarter location, the profits would have been taxed at 25 or even at 17 also. So it is making more sense from a tax perspective that to the maximum extent I push the profits to the overseas headquarter location, but the answer is no. Today, the way the construct of the tax rates are there, it makes more sense for every auto manufacturer, overseas auto manufacturer, that rightfully, if there is an opportunity to push more profits to India and then repatriate those profits, probably it might be a better option. But this is CKD. If I take to the next level where there is a 66% tax rate, the cascading effect is even more. And the cascading effect is even more. What I did was, and rather I'll skip one slide and go to another slide. I looked at another BCD, highly BCD rated good, and I saw that it was 150% BCD. Here the cascading effect is even more, even more. So what is deciding the ETR for the group is not the corporate tax rate between India and the overseas company, but the custom duty rate, but basically the BCD rate, which is not creditable, which is a cost. It makes sense for auto manufacturers, spirit manufacturers, rightfully, what is rightfully due, to have maximum profits in India, and then those profits are repatriated from India to the overseas headquarter company. Vis-a-vis, what we have always taught is that have India limit its profits, limit the profits in India, and have maximum of the profits in the headquarter company. Rather, an ETR optimized solution might be to push more of the profits into India and have that repatriated. But whatever is there, it should be at arm's length, should be justifiable under the customs, with the custom authorities and with the under the transfer pricing regime. Then only this tinkering of the price should be done. This should be done only to achieve the right number. There is another way to find a solution, but it is a debatable solution. The solution is I still pull out profits from the Indian company. I limit my profits in the Indian company, but not in the form of material cost. Vis-a-vis, I pull it in the form of an industrial franchise fee or a royalty fee. So I have two charges. One is sale of CKD and sale of components, and second is the royalty model. Unless until the Indian Custom Authority comes and includes the royalty which is paid by the Indian company to the overseas headquarter company within for BCD purposes, if it doesn't, obviously we should detest that this is not the correct way to do it. If you can detest that, and if you can resist that, then if you see that the first option where there was a total tax of 309, and in the next model there is a 50 rupees migration of profit from Indian company to the headquarter company. In the option 2, it is embedded in the transfer price of the product. In option 3, it is in the royalty. You would note that the tax cost from 309, where it went to 327, has actually gone down to 304. So one has to be very careful with the revenue streams it creates, with the transaction streams it creates, because the same effect could be achieved by a different transaction flow. But obviously, there is a lot of litigation around this, because the Indian Custom Authorities always litigate that the price of the intangible, which is a separate 50 payout, should be included for computation of BCD purposes. But obviously, that can be litigated, and that can be fought, and that can be convinced, because there are two different things. The components which are coming are material, and they could be at a cost plus, and the revenue stream which is in the form of royalty is for intangibles. One can definitely differentiate the two. Now, I will just explain, and I've explained this in my earlier example also, that in the case of spirits, how do you push more profits into India? Or if you want to create a franchisee fee to pull out profits, you need to split your functions between the overseas headquarter company and the Indian group company, between the routine and the non-routine. And as you can see from this slide, this is my assessment of the routine functions for the overseas company, manufacturing supply of concentrate, and for the Indian group company, the routine function would be dilution, filtration, bottling, and distribution of spirits, marketing support services, daily process know and legal ownership of the trademark, which is a non-routine intangible for the liquor manufacturer in the overseas location. And for the non-routine intangibles, it is the economic ownership of the marketing intangibles which will be the non-routine intangibles for the Indian group company. In my assessment, in one of my experiences, I saw that, and I'm trying to reflect that to a pie chart, that the returns towards intangibles is in this proportion. If you look at the routine return, which is the blue shaded, it's a routine return for the overseas headquarter, and the orange part is a routine return for the Indian operations. The brown shaded portion actually, in one of my practical experiences I saw was the return for the intangibles. So you can appreciate that if one puts this transfer pricing and does a proper supply chain study, a proper value chain study, and then a value chain and a supply chain study, how much of it you can identify is on account of the intangibles in the liquor industry. And as I reflected in my example, if I can attribute a significant part rightfully, which is rightfully there, towards the intangibles, I could improve the ETR for that particular group to a significant extent in an inbound scenario. I'm just giving a list of some of the products where there's high custom duty, high BCD rates in India, which range to the range of 40 to 150%, whereas the effective corporate tax rates in India are 32.65. So you can clearly see the arbitrage which exists. So one has to definitely, when it does a study under custom duty BCD, when it does a valuation, there has to be support from transfer price. The two have to be integrated together and seen together, because as I showed in this slide, not only at the setting up stage, but when you have so if you look at the third bullet point, that how much of an effect it has when you are setting up a policy. And if you look at the fourth bullet point, if you don't set up the policy, there's a consequent transfer pricing adjustment. What is the kind of pain which a group has to go through? That is, revising returns and all of that retroactive effect. It's a very difficult task to give effect to. So to save yourself from all of it, that both the whole complete supply chain study or a value chain study in a cross-border scenario, from an inbound perspective, knowing that BCD is quite a difficult task in India, it's also a difficult task to, it's a difficult riddle to solve in many other countries. It should be attended to together with transfer pricing. So all what we discussed till now were inbound concepts. I'm just recapitulating what we discussed. We discussed what we discussed was principal structures, how principal structures could be achieved in India. What we discussed was how entrepreneurs who are facing AMP issues with the Indian revenue, how could they solve how could they get a resolution with the revenue department for the higher AMP expenses. I also showed you the interplay between customs. I also showed you the significant AMP expenses, which is many times a pain for the distributor, because the revenue authorities are chasing them, that because of significant AMP expenses or significant selling distribution expenses, you need to have a higher profitability or a separate remuneration, or it's a separate international transaction. So Harvard supply chain study solves all of these riddles. And when you're doing a supply chain study, don't do it one-sided. It has to be two-sided or multiple-sided. Don't do it with corporate in the context of corporate taxes. It needs to be done in the context of custom duties, GSTs, and FTAs, and all of that. Now, obviously, all of these principles do apply, other than the principal structure which I discussed in the start. All of that also apply in an outbound context. But in an outbound context, the dynamics are a little different. And that is where I would want to first show the ETR effects. I know I'm jumping into an ETR effect before discussing substance of the transactions. I'll come to that later on. But it's important to understand, because there's been a recent amendment in the Finance Act 2020, by virtue of which dividends, the foreign dividends which are received, and the way they are repatriated, upstreamed, the impact of that changes a lot. So what was the story? If you ask me, my solution to you, my proposition to you till 1st of Feb was quite different. But after 1st of Feb, my solution is, my proposition will be quite different. So I've given an example out here where A, B, C, and D are four countries outside India, where the corporate tax rates are 0, 17, 19, and 25. And I am, for a moment of simplicity, I've assumed there is a zero withholding tax. And from an India taxability perspective, if you see, there's a column which is India C and India I. For a moment, we can ignore India I, but I'll just tell you what it means. India C represents where the holding company of the Indian HQ company is again a company, and where the holding of the Indian HQ company is an individual. So, but I think so that doesn't make much of a difference. Reason being, if in all the cases they change uniformly. So we'll just focus on India C and the total tax rate for the group. So the total operations of the company is A plus B plus C plus D plus India C. So assume they are 100 rupees of profits in A, B, and C and D, and they have 400 rupees of profit in India. And they pay their taxes in the respective countries. And then India decides to declare 300 rupees of dividends to its shareholders. And there's no remittance of dividends from the A, B, and C, D to India company. The total tax cost for the group comes to 29.5%. Please mark those numbers, 29.5%. It's very important. Now, there's no repatriation. This is an example of no repatriation. No repatriation, and an average corporate tax cost, if you see to the left hand side, is 15%. That is 0, 17, 14, 19, and 25. If you take an average of it, a simple average, you will equal to the weighted average because it's all 100 rupees of profits in the 4 locations. The average corporate tax cost is 15% for the overseas operations. The corporate tax cost for India is 25%. The DDT, the dividend repatriation, dividend withholding tax in these countries is for a moment assumed to be 0. And in this example, there's been no repatriation from A, B, and C, D into C. The tax cost is 29.5. Let us look at the example. A little bit shift. There is a repatriation to India. Does anything change? Nothing changes. It's still 29.5%. Because the dividend on foreign taxes to the extent of 17.5%, which I was paying, which I would have paid, I don't have to pay because I've got 300 rupees of dividends from outside India, and I've distributed 300 rupees of dividends to my to my shareholders in India. That is, Indian headquarter company will distribute same amount of dividends, upstream that much amount of dividends to its shareholders. Therefore, that 17.5% under the new regime will not be triggered. There's 0% withholding tax, no trigger effect. So if you see, it's a tax neutral situation, provided the withholding tax from A, B, and C and D is 0%. I'll give it a little bit of tweak. Assume now, knowing that there's no difference because there's a 0 withholding tax. So there's tax neutrality between option 1 and 2. What I'm going to do, okay, is I'm going to shift 100 rupees of profit. So if you see in the example, India C had a PBT of 400 in this example. I took out 100 rupees of profits and split 25, 25, 25 in each of these companies, A, B, and C. So the PBT, which was 100, is now 125. What has happened? My ETR has gone down to 25.94%. So countries where the corporate tax cost plus the withholding tax cost is less than 25%. Here the average withholding tax cost is 0% and the average corporate tax cost is 15%. So anything which I shift outside India and I get it back, there's no tax effect. So what happens? The India headco company becomes a pass-through entity for that extent of profits, and there will be no effect. But if I'm shifting profits outside by way of an appropriate transfer pricing policy, which is at arm's length, and I'm rightfully doing so, if it is, I'm considering to be appropriate for a moment and considering to be at arm's length, and that 100 rupees is shifted, I'm bringing down my ETR to 25.94%. But if I complicate this example, and I take this example to same thing, 29.5%, 10% withholding tax, no repatriation, 400 rupees in India, 100 rupees between A, B, and C and D. I repatriate the profits to India, 400 again in India, 100 outside. My ETR, which was 29.5 all along. So if you see, it was 29.5 in this case, 29.5 in this case. It came down when I pushed some portion of the profits from India to outside because my average cost was 15%. It brought my ETR to 25.94. Here it was again 29.5 because I've not repatriated the dividends. But there's a dividend withholding tax of 10%. Please be mindful. Here the dividend withholding tax is 10%. Here the ETR increases to 33.3%. but I can give a counter effect to it by shifting a part of the profits outside, because if you look, the ETR has come down to 28.75%. Because what is happening, the average tax cost for A, B, C, and D is 15% corporate tax cost. There's a withholding tax of 10%. So that 10% on 85 is 8.5. So there's a savings which is getting created out. And that savings is going to bring down the ETR by 28.7. So today the cardinal rule is, if in a particular country you're investing and you're doing operations and you're setting up a transfer pricing policy, the corporate tax cost in that country and the withholding tax cost, because in today's era, you're not going to get a credit of the withholding tax. Either you get a credit of the withholding tax and you absorb it against 17.5, but then you don't get a credit. Actually, you don't have that option. So because you don't have to pay that 17.5% tax on foreign dividends, because you're dividending out that money. So therefore, your withholding tax which is coming is not creditable anywhere. So what is happening, that is becoming a cost in the system. So assume if I look at country A in isolation, my tax cost is corporate tax rate, if you see, is 0%, and my withholding tax is 10%. Whereas my corporate tax rate in India is 25%. It makes sense for me to have little more extra profits within the arm's length range in country A. If I look at country B, 17% plus 10%. So 87 of 83, the 10% of 83 would be 8. So it would be coming around 25. So B would be a neutral position. Whether I have the profits, little extra profits in B, or whether I have the profits in India, it will be a tax neutral position. But the moment I move into C and D, it will make sense to have most of those profits sitting in India. So countries like US, where there's a 25% tax rate and then there's a withholding tax of 15%, it doesn't make sense to have push more profits into US. It makes more sense to have a transfer pricing policy. Obviously, you cannot fabricate things, because today in the post-BEPS regime, you cannot design based on a tax rate, but you need to actually recheck and re-sanitize your transfer pricing policies to see to it whether you want to have a little more extra profits in US or extra profits in India. Because you're having more extra profits in US, you're taking an ETR at higher levels. You're making it more tax inefficient. Whereas in countries like Singapore, in Dubai, and 17% would be UK. UK would be a tax neutral position. Rather, UK would be beneficial because there's no withholding tax on dividends. So it would make sense. So, so there are two variables which one is to see: your withholding tax cost and your corporate tax in that particular country. When you're setting up a transfer pricing policy, whether you should have a little tilt of your transfer price towards the overseas jurisdiction or towards India. So this is what has changed in the new tax regime when you're setting up your global supply chain. I have, it's already 5:20 and I have 2 case studies. Should I continue with these 2 case studies, or would you want me to open it up for question answers?
Aditya ji,
Yes.
I suggest we can take up the question answer.
Sure.
What do you?
Sure.
मिश्रा जी, question answer. मुर्तजा भाई.
नहीं है सर, एक मिनट.
हाँ, तो मिश्रा जी क्वेश्चन आंसर वो स्क्रीन पे दिखाओ ना.
Hello.
Yeah, sir, within a minute he will display the question. What questions participants has raised.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
सर क्वेश्चन नहीं है सर, एक भी.
Question नहीं है. Okay.
नहीं sir.
Okay. So you can take one case study. Murtaza bhai, what do you suggest?
We have time. So Aditya, you can please.
Yeah. You can take one case
Okay.
study then.
I would do so. So from an outbound perspective, the sector which becomes very important is the pharma sector. So if I go back to the concepts I discussed in inbound.
Aditya, kindly share your screen. We are not able to see the PPT, so if you can share the screen.
You're not able to see the PPT?
Yeah. You have to share the screen.
सर मैं हाँ सर.
Is Are you able to see the PPT now? Hello?
2 मिनट सर 2 मिनट ओके सर पीपीटी सर
Yes, we can see the PPT now, Aditya.
Okay, thank you. So all the concepts of intangibles, contribution by two parties, profit splits, all what I discussed squarely applies in an outbound scenario also, because transfer pricing principles will apply harmoniously. It's just that the ETR calculations change when it's inbound and when it is outbound. So that is all what changes, but the concepts of transfer pricing don't change. Yes, definitely in an inbound scenario, you would see more branded products. In an outbound scenario, you will see more pharma, technology, pharma, software. So the industry which you see in inbound and outbound would be different, and the tax rates would be different. Apart from the arm's length principles, the transfer pricing principles apply the same. So if I look at in the pharma sector, there is a patented category of products which takes roughly 10 to 14 years to develop, which is a lot more complex. After many failures, there would be a sign of success, and that is why with a long period, more failures before final success, the returns are significantly higher. Whereas generic products are more like a reverse engineering kind of a thing. And if you look at the bar which I made below, so the more it goes towards the right, it becomes more complex. The more it goes towards the left, it becomes lesser complex. And when I say lesser complex, it will have lesser system profits. When I say to the right, it becomes more complex, it will have higher system profits. So different category of products will have their value being created, or the key value drivers at different places. Like a specialty patented pharmaceutical, its value will lie in the research development. Biologics also, it will lie in the research and development. For biosimilars, it will be in the manufacturing, regulatory access. For generics, branded, it will be in the marketing. For unbranded, it is how quickly you can reach out to the market, how quickly you can position yourself, how quickly you can reach out to your dealers. So it's a different dynamics. It's your access, how quickly. It's a first mover advantage in case of unbranded generics. So whenever we have a pharma client, we need to understand, when someone in the pharma sector, we need to understand in which of these categories he's falling, to understand what are the key value drivers, what is resulting in the value creation, what is resulting in the creation of intangibles. I'll share a small example, and this happened practically. I experienced this thing. So there was an Indian manufacturer, pharma generic manufacturer of unbranded products. He was doing R&D, manufacturing, execution and implementation, and the critical function which is shaded in red, strategy and decision making, when it set up its distribution arm in US. When it set up its distribution arm in US, it set it up, there was limited people, 4-5 people, then 10 people, 15 people, but they were all doing execution of the sales and distribution activities. As it was not a branded generic, so there was no marketing activities, but it was more sales activities and distribution, logistics, more of those kind of activities. And an appropriate return of 3% was at arm's length. The Indian revenue accepted it, the US revenue accepted it. Over passage of time, over a passage of a decade, 15 years, everyone's continued to acknowledge that the US distributor is a distributor, normal routine distributor, and supposed to earn 3% and nothing more than that. Until an incident happened when one had to go and recheck whether the characterization which we made 10 to 15 years back still holds good or not. What happened was they had to they identified a good opportunity to acquire a group company, a third-party company, which had a top line of valued at 4,000 crores with a top line of 2,500 crores and a profitability of 250 crores. So there was a US company which they thought of acquiring, and they would acquire with a mix of internal loans and external loans and everything, where the interest cost would come to 200%. Now we all know that in 2017 when the thin cap regulations were introduced, the interest expense could not exceed 30% of EBITDA, and it would be disallowed beyond that. So the company did a simple mathematics, and it said that okay, my business turnover is 5,000 crores, my system profits is 30%. The US distribution profits out of the 30%, out of 1,500 crores, I am having 150 crores tax in India, in US. What I'm going to acquire is 2,500 crores in US, and it will be merged into my US entity. The profitability of the acquired business is 250 crores. Therefore, the consolidated profitability is 250 plus 150, which is already there. It is 400. And therefore, the interest allowed under thin cap would be not more than 120, whereas my actual interest expense is 200. So what was happening? The consolidated EBITDA would be 400, but the EBITDA levels which I was requiring to not get for the US thin cap provisions to get triggered, my EBITDA level should have been 666, or something in the range of 650, 700. Now, how could that be possible? You know, at that point of time, we started understanding that how did this acquisition happen? Then they started telling that 15 years back when they set up the operations in US, it was some minuscule operation with 3 to 4 people. Then they started ramping up their sales and distribution activities. Then they set up a warehouse, and they started supplying in multiple states in US, and they started growing. Then they got some strategy people, how to grow the business, how to capture the market better. Competition grew. Then the promoter started flying to that particular country and spending more time out there. Then he started spending more than 100 days out there. And because the US market was becoming so competitive, so fierce, they recruited some very strategic people to fight it on in the market. And then in the course of time, they realized that to capture the market better, they need to make this acquisition. So when I heard this story, I said, with all of this happening over the last decade, and you've migrated long time back, or probably a couple of years back, from a simple distributor to a significant strategy and decision maker. So if you look at this slide number 41, probably the strategy decision making still rests in India, but to a minuscule level, and the strategy and decision making has to a large extent migrated, because the US generic space, and especially the unbranded, where this para 1 filing and all those concepts are there, you need to be very nimble footed. You need to be on your toes to decide on the spur of the moment which product, when to research. If you miss on an opportunity in launching a product just by 1 month, you might lose on an opportunity of making millions of dollars. So being closer to the market, understanding the market specifically from a US unbranded market perspective, it is very much critical, and which over the passage of time they had developed in US. So what we did was we rethought the policy. We acknowledge that this is gradually migrated from a simple distributor to a strategy decision maker. So that system profits of 1,500, of which only 150 was parted and kept in US. Probably 400, 500 would be parted and be residing in US. And with that amount of profits, they would have met the US thin cap regulations. So you would appreciate something which went unnoticed just because of an acquisition. And understanding the story of acquisition, we came to know that probably over passage of time, the supply chain, the characterization in the supply chain had evolved actually. There's just one last example I'll take 5 more minutes, then my presentation would be complete. I'm taking a small example of a Indian headquarter company, probably where the R&D is taking place in India, and it sets up a regional hub in UK, where it does the strategy, decision making, market control, everything, marketing, everything. And the Subco 1 to Subco 5, they are doing routine operations, execution, and implementation. So these kind of limited operations are being undertaken in the Subco 1 to Subco 4, and this central nodal entity, which I was discussing, in the principal entity. In this era of centralization, we centralize the strategy and everything to the UK company, and Subco 1 to Subco 5 are just the executioners. What would that result in a transfer pricing policy? So the intercompany price would look something like this: that UK having its corporate tax rate of 17%, and for a moment I've assumed that Subco 1 to Subco 5 have a tax rate of 25%, but because most of the profits are residing in UK, and I've limited the profits of a distributor of 3% in Subco 1 to Subco 4, but my sales are all happening in between subco 1 to subco 5. Sorry, subco 1 to subco 5. Even though in the countries where I'm selling, the tax rate is 25%, but my ETR of the group is 19.4%. So ideally, had it been a decentralized structure, my ETR would have been 25%. But my ETR is not 25, it is 19.4 because I worked into a principal structure, a centralized model. But this is when everything is hunky-dory, everything is going well. What if things go wrong? In subco 3, subco 4 and subco 5, there are losses. I'm not saying the companies are having losses, but the sales which I'm doing in those countries have losses. That means there are system losses in the sales which I'm making subco 3, 4 and 5. What will happen is, as I've made them limited risk distributors or routine distributors, I've assured them a return of 3%. Even though I'm having system losses, but I'm having profits in those and I'm paying taxes in those countries. So my design, so-called wonderful design of 19.4%, where my has crumbled down and has come down to 23%, come up to 23%. So my ETR cost is a lot more higher. First of all, I'm having a loss and I'm paying a higher tax rate as well. In this case also, I practically saw and I tried to understand the cause of the loss. And in this, I discovered that subco 3, subco 4 and subco 5. And here, I would want to divert your attention to the heading of this this case study. One size fits all. No, not necessary. And this example explains that. We understood that subco 3, 4 and 5 were very difficult markets. They could not be remotely controlled, and there were frequent visits of people from UK to subco 3, 4 and 5. And eventually people had to move into 3, 4 and 5 to limit the losses and to manage the operations. And most of the decision making, even though it was pre-planned at 1 to 5, all of them would be limited distributors. But you cannot stop the commercial realities. The commercial realities made the people travel and sit there and actually migrate to 3, 4 and 5 to manage the fierce competitive markets of 3, 4 and 5, which were not so simple as 1 and 2 markets. And eventually I created a lot of substance of marketing strategy and all of that in 3, 4 and 5. By virtue of that, what did I do? They were not limited to being any more distributors, limited as distributors or distributors. They became significant value creators with decision making, all of that taking place in subco 3, 4 and 5. What happened by virtue of that? The losses were split between the principal company and the subco 3, and most of the with the split of the losses, the system profits, which is 0, actually resulted in a ETR back to 19.4%. So what was targeted at the beginning was achieved at the end again. So if you set up a policy for 5 of your distributors, not necessarily all 5 have to conduct in the same manner. Ideally, it looks good, it looks attractive, it looks uniform, it looks harmonious, it looks convincing when you have a uniform, harmonious policy. But one has to understand what works for Sri Lanka doesn't work for Bangladesh, and what works for Bangladesh doesn't work for India and doesn't work for Nepal. So even if someone is in the SAARC region, not necessarily you can have the same policy. You can set up a same intercompany price, but all of that will not be meeting the commercial realities. I'll give you a small example. Look at the Indian industry, the pharma industry, where you are not allowed to, other than OTC products, you're not allowed to do significant marketing, branding of your pharmaceutical products. Whereas some markets have regulatory permissions where they could do significant branding, marketing, and adopt certain practices of a trade which are not available in India. So what they were applying for a principal structure in a different location would not be applicable for India. The liquor industry, the cigarette industry, you're not allowed to do marketing in India. You cannot have the same harmonious principle what you have applied for a Dubai or for a Saudi or for a Philippines or for a Malaysia. You cannot apply the same in India. You should attempt to do that, but not necessarily certain industries don't permit that. So one size suits all is not the true story. So that's about it. I think so. I've tried to cover from an inbound, outbound perspective, discussing tax rates, discussing different pricing approaches, discussing the customs implications, indirect tax implications, FTA implications. This is all I could do to scratch the surface in this 1.5 hours.
Aditya, thanks
Yes.
a lot. for such a decent and great coverage. There are a couple of questions which
Please.
Mishra ji is, he will, yeah, here they are. If you can look at them, yeah.
Yeah. For the purpose of computing system profits, whether corporate overheads need to be considered. See, when you look at the system profits, you need to look at all the costs in that transaction, starting from the start to the end. So if you can have a fair allocation of the corporate overheads and you feel the corporate overheads have a contribution to it, then definitely why not? But when I say corporate overheads, are you talking about shareholder services or services? It's a definite no. But if it is non-shareholder services, definitely it could be a part of it. But it has to contribute value to the transaction. Whether routine or non-routine, it doesn't matter. I'll go to the next question.
Yes, please.
While deciding HO principal company country, companies start up in liquor industry and planning to raise funds also, what all should be considered from monetary perspective? What all needs to be assessed, like capital gains tax, withholding tax, dividend distribution tax in the country? Well, if you ask me, there are many multiple factors to be seen actually. So there's a cost of doing business also. So if you ask me, and again you have to create substance. So if you're a startup and I suggest a Singapore to you, or I suggest a Dubai to you, you know the cost of employing people is 2.5 times vis-a-vis India. So I may suggest from a tax perspective, attractive countries like Singapore, Ireland, or Dubai, or many more countries which have wonderful treaty networks, which have a lot of tax incentives. But in a startup phase, I would say that your commercial realities, you should be more closer to the market. You should look at your control of costs. It should not be the tail wags the dog wags the tail. So I think so for a startup, the commercial realities will have a more a larger bearing than the tax elements of it. So stick to your commercial realities in the initial phase, because I've worked very closely, very closely for one of the largest startups. It's a success story, and now we are hearing it's not so much a success story because in this downturn. But I've worked for them also, and I've experienced that the first 4 to 5 years, even though it's a startup running into millions and billions today, the first 4 to 5 years you need to be closer to the market. You need to be closer to your cost cutting measures or cost control measures, and all of the other things fall in place at a later point of time when you have good valuations. So that's my advice to that to the startup. In your pharma case study, how you compute arm's length margin for distributor who has profile which I mentioned, high profile people, significant people, functions. Okay, so if I go back to my example of a residual profit split method, so if I look at a generic manufacturer, a generic product manufacturer, and if I don't look at, so there'll be a branded category, there'll be an unbranded category, and there's a different solution for both of them. Because if it's a branded category, remember you have the GSK case law of US, which will actually make you realize that probably the sales entity creates a lot of intangibles. And if it's an unbranded, then your people who are sitting on the ground, who are taking the strategy decisions, and your people sitting in India who are taking the strategy decisions, you need to identify and weigh them. So after giving a routine returns to the Indian company for the manufacturing and giving a routine returns for the sales and distribution and warehousing activity, these strategy activities which are taking place between India and the US, that has to be weighed, and then the residual profits has to be split between the two countries. And I've done practical examples in 3 cases. I've done that. I've seen it is very much feasible. But again, the story, as I say, repeat, is very different in case of generics which are branded and generics which are unbranded. Generics branded is a completely different. it's more of an AMP level expenditures and a lot more. It's completely different. How to say from poem perspective if distributor is LRD and simply following guidance of Indian management? Well, if you look at the poem regulations, one of the key criteria is that if the transaction itself has are at arm's length, so if the people out there are executioners and your margins are that of an executioner in the local location, in the sales location, then I don't think so there will be a trigger of a poem, because what you have retained is not any of the significant profits. You have retained only profits pertaining to the execution function. So if your transaction itself is at arm's length, your poem will not be an issue. That I can assure you. Rather, in one of the cases, I remember going to the AP authority and getting a stamp on the transfer price, showing that the local entity was doing very routine functions, and indirectly the AP office also did confirm that this does mitigate your poem risk to a large extent. So indirectly, not directly, but there was a reference that there would not be a poem trigger in that case. They didn't take the courage to write it on the AP document, but in a subtle manner, they did acknowledge that these significant functions are taking place in India. They're routine functions outside India, and what routine functions are outside India, the profits are only pertaining to the routine functions. So there was some sort of an acknowledgement in the FAR analysis which we brought in and which was stamped by the AP authority. So if you get your transaction at arm's length, your poem risk itself gets mitigated to a large extent. There are 5 questions. I have answered all 5 of them.
Great. Thank you very much, Aditya,
Thank you.
for
Thank you, Murtaza.
covering the topic in such detail, and like really niche topic, and these are subjects where very few practitioners are there, and I'm sure this is the top end service where the rate per hour which you guys are charging must be much more than what a normal practitioner does. And hence I would request or encourage all the participants that whoever has got interested in like international tax, they should really pursue it and take it ahead as a service line. With that, may I now request Regional Council Member C. Manish Gadia to propose a hearty vote of thanks. Manish bhai, over to you.
Thank you, Murtaza bhai. Before going to proposing vote of thanks to Aditya, first thing is I salute the dedication of Murtaza bhai for organizing a webinar series continuously on a daily basis, and now from tomorrow onward with 3 hours in a day. So keeping each minute point in detail. Hats off to you, Murtaza bhai. Great work. Continue the same. Now you all know that cross-border supply chain structuring is a very complex topic, and as Aditya said in the beginning that he can continue for 7 days also speaking, and to make it crisp and fit it into 1.5 hours is really a tough job. But he has clearly given all this case, given the case studies with some examples, covering various things in 1.5 hours in such a lucid language. So thank you, Aditya, for giving us a valuable lecture. And I request all the participants to carry a vote of thanks with loud applause. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. We are happy to close.